Welcome back to our course on PSE 15. In this section we're going to look at cropping in expert mode. You can actually crop in quick mode, we did that earlier on, and there is a guided edit for cropping as well. But you get the maximum control and flexibility when you crop in expert mode. The crop tool is in the modify group, and if I just click on that tool to select it, there are actually three tools in the crop tool group. There's the cropping tool, which is the one we're going to concentrate on in this section, the cookie cutter that I'll just mention briefly at the end, and then there is a perspective crop tool that I'll also come to a little bit later on in the section. If you've used an earlier version of PSE, certainly one that was made before the last couple of versions, it may well be that various aspects of cropping have changed since then. So for instance, we have crop suggestions, the grid overlays have changed, and some additional controls and options have been added. So if your experience is with a much older version, it might well be worth you still working through this section so that I can explain the more recent additions. Another thing to point out here is that because there are so many cropping options in expert mode, you may want to refer to other sources. So for instance, over on the right here, that little question mark symbol, tool help, click on that. And whenever you see that symbol, and you don't see it everywhere, it will normally take you through to a relevant help item on adobe.com. Don't forget also the contents of the PDF, which is sometimes the same as the help and sometimes different. When I first invoked this crop tool, PSE presented me with a crop suggestion, and in fact there are various crop suggestions down here. They're not very different, but that very much depends on the image how much they vary. But what I'm going to do on this occasion first of all is to cancel that, so I'm going to press on the cancel current operation sign, and I want to draw your attention to something else. Down here next to where you can see the zoom level, there's a little drop down that we haven't talked about so far, and it's currently showing document sizes. If you choose instead document dimensions, that's actually a very helpful control because it tells you the physical size of the image at an allotted resolution. So at 72 dots per inch, this image will be 45 and a bit inches wide and 34 inches high. If you're cropping to achieve a particular size, then this can be very helpful, particularly if you recall that the physical size does depend on the resolution. So, bearing that in mind, let's just look at some of those controls that we have down there. To the right of the selector for the tool, we can choose the size of a crop. There are some defaults there, but you can also say no restrictions, so you can change it to any aspect ratio you like. Use the photo ratio, so that's the original ratio of the image we're starting with, and then there are various standard presets. Let's suppose that I want to do a 4x6. There's a control under there where I can switch that round to make it 6x4 or 4x6. Let's stick with the 6x4 option. And then I have a number of crop suggestions. These are based on a visual analysis of the image by PSE, but for the moment I'm not going to use one of those suggestions. I'm going to choose my own crop. First of all, I want the resolution of this image to be 300 dots per inch. It's currently at 478.5 based on the pixel dimensions of the existing image. So I specify 300. And then when it comes to doing the crop, all I have to do is to click and draw my crop rectangle on the picture. One of the things you'll notice here is that once again you've got those vertical and horizontal lines. These correspond to what's called the rule of thirds. And before I do this crop, let me just explain a little about the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds says that for reasons related to how the human eye works, when you look at images, the most interesting images are created by placing the points of interest at the points of intersection of those lines. So in this particular case, if you thought, say, that those two bigger horses, the ones that are standing further forward, are the main points of interest, what you would try to do is to position them at two of the 4 points of interest two of the four intersections between these lines. If I click on the crop rectangle, I can actually move it around. Obviously don't want to go outside the original image, but if I put it somewhere like that, then I'm pretty close to what the rule of thirds says achieves the most interesting image. Unfortunately, I cut off a bit of a horse's tail on the left there, so I may just move it back a little. The rule of thirds is certainly something to be used with quite a high level of pragmatism. Having drawn my crop rectangle, use the rule of thirds to decide how to place the rectangle and set my resolution at 300 dots per inch, then I just click on tick and my image is cropped. Note the figure down here now in the document dimensions option, the one we just changed to. It's 6 inches by 4 inches at 300 dots per inch, and that's my cropped image. Let me undo that. And let's look at one or two other important aspects of this. First of all, when I started to draw my crop box, note the little figure that you can see hovering over the screen is actually telling you the size of the rectangle you've drawn so far. So if you're actually doing this as a freehand exercise, perhaps you put no restriction on the aspect ratio, you can use that to pretty accurately draw a rectangle of a certain size. Now, obviously, if you've got a restriction, as I have here, and I'm looking for a 6 by 4, it won't let me draw something that doesn't have that aspect ratio. But if I had no restriction, then that would be a very useful way of getting to exactly the size that I want. And once I've drawn my crop rectangle, you see the rule of thirds there. There is a grid overlay control down here. If I don't want the rule of thirds, if I click there, I don't have any markings. What I want is a regular grid, which I can use to accurately measure aspects of my cropped image, then I can use that as an alternative to the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is very much a matter of personal preference. And just sticking with the overlay for a moment, there's another technique that I think can sometimes be useful. And that is, if you have an image that needs straightening, and we're going to look at straightening in a few sections' time, you can actually straighten as you crop. Now, I know on this occasion this is not the case, but if you look at the horizon behind those horses, let's suppose that is supposed to be horizontal. I can straighten, in that sense, this image. Let me put that grid on again. If I put the cursor outside the crop rectangle, you'll see that it's now a double-headed arrow with a bend. And if I click, I can rotate the crop rectangle and actually crop at an angle. Of course, I can crop at an angle anyway, but if I did that and then committed, my cropped image now has a roughly horizontal horizon. So that's another useful technique as well. As I've been doing each of these cropping operations, in between them I've been going back to the original image, and rather than using undo several times, on the edit menu I'm using the revert option, and revert always goes right back to the original. Let me now switch off the grid overlay altogether and let's look at the crop suggestions. There are 4 of them. If I select one of them that I like the look of and commit it, that's not actually the end of the story, because what PSE then does is to offer a further 4 crop suggestions on that cropped image, and of course this can go on for some time. Crop suggestions can be very useful and they're well worth looking at, and don't forget that you can always move the crop rectangle round if you need to. Let us look next at the cookie cutter tool. It works pretty much in the same way that you would expect any cookie cutter to work, in that you can cut a shape, not in pastry but in one of your images. You choose the shape using this control. It's a gallery. You can access the gallery by clicking on that drop down, and the gallery is categorized. The top category is all elements, so if you want to look at all of the available cookie shapes, select that and scroll through using the scroll bar on the right. Alternatively, you can choose a particular type of shape. So for instance, you might say, I want a fruit shape, and maybe we'll have an apple. Horses like apples. Having chosen your shape, you can decide on the size. You can say, I want an unconstrained cookie, or you can say I want one with defined proportions, defined size, fixed size. If you need to specify the size, there's a width and height box there that you have access to. And then you can also decide whether you want to draw the shape from the center or not. On this occasion, I'm going to draw it from the center. When you cut something out of an image, you can very often finish up with a jagged edge. And in order to avoid this, you can feather the edge of this particular cut. I'm going to introduce just a bit of feather in here. In fact, what I'm going to do is put in 10 pixels of feathering. 10 is actually quite a lot. You can easily overdo feathering and finish up with a very blurry edge, but let's try 10. Now on this occasion we're going to actually crop the image, so let's click on crop. Now I position roughly in the middle of where I want my apple to be as I'm cookie cutting from the center. Click and drag, get to the point that I want to get to, commit, and there is my image. Note how the crop there has removed all of the spare space from around the apple. If I hadn't had crop, I'd have a lot more space. You may be wondering what that checkerboard pattern is. The checkerboard pattern indicates transparency. So this image is actually a rectangle, but apart from the parts that are in the apple, it's transparent. I'm going to leave you to experiment with the cookie cutter, and in particular try those tool options, because many of the options such as feathering are going to appear quite a bit from now on. You can see the effects of feathering here in that the edges of the apple are quite blurred, but that means that you don't see any jaggedness in them at all. I'd now like to look at the third of the crop tools, and this is the new tool. This is the perspective crop tool. Quite often, if you take a picture of a tall building, particularly if you're quite close to it, as I was here, you get a misleading effect on the shape of the building. This can be quite effective, but sometimes it just seems a little bit too much. And what you'd really like to do is to more faithfully reflect the actual shape of the building. This one looks as though it's narrowing towards the top much more than it actually does, because I was standing relatively close to the bottom of the building. You can get related problems if you take a picture using a wide angle lens. With the perspective crop tool, what you can do is to straighten the building out to make it look more uniform. The amount you do obviously is entirely up to you. I'm going to slightly overdo this one, so with the perspective crop tool selected, what I'm going to do is to draw a crop box, which is actually going to be on almost the whole image anyway, and then I'm going to pull the top right hand corner in a little with the mouse, and the top left hand corner in a little with the mouse. Now watch carefully what happens when I commit this. Look at the tower now, and as you can see, it significantly straightens the tower out, in that the top of the tower isn't as relatively narrow compared to the bottom as it was. So I've removed a lot of the effect of perspective there. I may well have significantly overdone that, and of course you can introduce other visual problems by doing this, but it's very useful when you're dealing with objects which have become misshapen because of the angle at which you took the picture. As with the cookie cutter, I'm going to let you experiment with this. You can crop to a certain size, you can set the resolution, you can show the grid or not. That's the perspective crop tool. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one.